Okay. Good evening to you once again. This is the Beat London 103.6. My name is Douglas Jakin, and as I had mentioned a couple of minutes ago, we're going to be getting into our discussion with the Brent Health Council. And I want to just remind you that just in case this is the first time you're actually listening to this program, every last Wednesday of the month, we actually have a discourse with the Brent Health Council, put a show together called Brent Health Matters. And I keep saying Brent Health Council, but Brent Council, right? And the show's called Brent Health Matters. But essentially what we do on the show is we pick health topics and we bring experts and people with lived-in experiences to talk about these topics. The whole idea is to give our wonderful listeners a deeper insight into how to manage certain situations, identify certain problems, and also where they can get help from. Okay, today on the show, we are going to be discussing the ill effect of damp and mold. And just in case you don't know what that is, I'm going to be introducing my guests, and they will obviously give us the deep understanding of what that is. Come on the show this evening, and I would start with ladies first. I want to welcome Anne, who is a GP at Wembley. Anne, can you hear me?
Hi, yeah, hello. I can hear you. Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me on. I'm Anne Murphy. Yeah, I'm a GP in a practice in Wembley.
Fantastic. Okay, I also have Dr. Stephen Goldring. He's a pediatrician. Dr. Stephen, can you hear me?
Yep. Hi, very loud and clear. Again, thanks for inviting me onto the show. I'm a general pediatrician. I actually work out in Hillingdon, but I'm also the lead for the asthma network for children in northwest London, and I look after lots of kids with asthma and severe effects of damp and mold on kids with asthma.
Fantastic. Thanks for being on. I'm sure we're going to get a lot of insight from you as well. And then we have Gary and Ryan, both from the Brent Council. I will let them each come on and just quickly touch on what they do at Brent. Gary, do you want to go first?
Absolutely. Again, echo the panel in saying thanks for inviting me on. I'm a property services manager, so amongst other things, I lead on repairs and maintenance for Brent Council, and hopefully can provide some insight during the next hour on some of the do's and don'ts and ways to manage the issue of damp and mold within homes.
Right. Thank you very much for coming on. And then we've got Ryan. Hi, Ryan.
Hi, my name's Ryan Collymore. I'm the head of property services at Brent Council. So I deal with all things property. So that's all our response repairs, all our cyclical repairs and major works. And Gary is one of my managers who works in my team. And we just want to talk about what we're doing in terms of damp and mold in our council. Just offer some advice on how you can reduce damp and mold in your homes.
Right. Okay. Well, let's get into the conversation, and I hope that network does not interfere with the knowledge that's being shared this evening. So I'm going to start real quick, but let me start with Anne. Anne, so you're a GP at Wembley, okay? I'm going to ask the fundamental question, which is why we're here today. For those who don't know, could you explain, please, what is damp and what is mold, and briefly, what effects do they have on our health?
Okay, well, so damp is where there is water inside of a building that shouldn't be inside. Right. You know, Gary and Ryan will give you more about the technicalities, but from a GP's perspective, it means that somebody's house that should be warm and dry is instead cold and wet. And being cold and wet isn't good for you in and of itself, but cold, wet places tend to grow mold. And, you know, mold is not something which is meant to be growing in substantial amounts inside of somebody's house where they're living, because mold, it smells bad and it gives off spores, which are, I suppose, a little bit like pollen, but for mold. And just as pollen can aggravate people's allergies and asthma, mould can also irritate people and make them unwell. From a GP's perspective, I think the thing we don't talk enough about in terms of damp and mould is the effect it has on people's happiness and their psychological well-being. It's miserable being cold and wet and having all your clothes, your books, your children's toys, not being able to store them without them being affected by your living conditions. And I see a lot of people where, yes, they might come in with their asthma or their allergies, but actually what I'm sometimes more worried about is the psychological effects that living in bad conditions are having upon them. Because it just makes everything very difficult when you haven't got a safe, comfortable place to live.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to go further into that conversation, because you're going now into how it affects us also from a clinical point of view. Dr. Goldring, if you don't mind me bringing you in, you're a pediatrician. And I want a little bit about your bio as well. You've dealt with a lot of children who have asthma, and also in the research, it's also shown that if there's damp and mold in the house, it can also trigger asthma. So just real quick, what's been your experience so far, and with patients who have had symptoms that are triggered by mold?
Yeah, so asthma is a long-term condition. People that have asthma have different triggers that can set off their asthma symptoms, which are really unpleasant: coughing, wheezing. Children tend to cough at night time, and they go through these periods where they can have attacks of asthma, which were really frightening and make it difficult to breathe. And there are many different things that can set off and trigger asthma attacks, but one is exposure to these spores that Anne explained. So children, my experience is in a clinic, we see children who have, they come in, parents typically come in with pictures of mold in their child's bedroom and say, my child has got asthma and he's up coughing all night. Now, we can give medicines that can control asthma, but clearly it would be much better if a mold was not there in the first place, because it would be removing one trigger for that particular child.
Right. I want to, Gary, Ryan, let me start with you. I mean, obviously, you guys, you work you're like in charge of the housing, right? And I was listening to what Anne was saying, and she talked about how mold and damp, to a large extent, also or rather builds up because there's lack of ventilation. But you will understand that most people will not want to open their windows because, one, they want to keep warm. They want to make sure that they can, as much as possible, insulate themselves. And in your experience, how has that affected, residents in your borough or in the community? And what is, in your opinion, some of the solutions that people who are worried about, keeping warm? What is the solution in this case, from your point of view?
So we always say that to reduce damp and mold in your properties, you need to reduce the condensation within the property. So we say that your property needs to be at a certain temperature, but also needs to be ventilated well. If residents are worried about losing heat, what they can do is just make sure that when they're doing activities within the property that create moisture, that they ventilate at those times. So for instance, in the morning when they're having a shower, they ventilate while they're in the shower, and for about 10 to 15 minutes after. And that reduces the moisture within the property and sometimes clears it. And you'll tend to notice that when your mirror, the steam goes away from your mirror, which tells you that most of the moisture is out of the air. Also, when cooking, when you're in the kitchen cooking, you don't necessarily need the heating because it's usually warm when you're cooking, but ventilate, because all the moisture from the steam that you're cooking can also go out the windows. So generally, if you're not going to have your heating to a level, I think they say you should have it about 18, then at least when you're doing or taking part in activities that create moisture, you need to ventilate at those moments. Gary will probably have some more to say about that.
Yeah, Gary, let me bring you in as well here. I mean, obviously, I'm assuming that when people, in your community or in the housing that you oversee, when they complain about mold, you're one of the people that they at some point that complaint comes to your desk, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I'd say if I go back a step, there are two main causes. It's either moisture built up within the property, within the home, or moisture that's entering the property that shouldn't. So a leak from above, penetrating from the side, or moisture rising up through the ground floor generally. The second one, and the external issue and the internal issue can result in the same symptoms. So black mold, green mold, or a white mold, like a fluffy texture. It's in terms of the point you made about residents not wanting to waste money on heating and then open the window, because it is a bit of a strange one to understand if you don't understand. It's more cost effective to heat your home if you expel the air that's got lots of moisture within it, because you might heat it up and then drop your temperature down because you think it's nice and warm. It will cool down a lot quicker if the air is damp. Short spells of getting rid of the moisture within the home will keep the property drier. The heat you're generating will last longer. It's almost like having a cup of tea. It doesn't stay hot for long. Drink it, otherwise it's going to get cold. And that's similar with air that's laden heavily with moisture. Could I just give one more sort of example?
Please, go ahead.
A washing machine can hold either 7 or 8 kilos of dry washing. When it comes out of the washing machine, it could be as much as 15 kilos, and that's moisture within the washing. Now, that's one of many explanations as to how you can get issues with mold within the home, because that mold is into the air. If you've sealed your home shut with all the windows shut, it's a false economy, because that moisture is in the air and it's not allowed to escape. And it escapes quite quickly if you create a draft from one end to the other to let that moisture out. 10 or 15 minutes, as Ryan said, shut your windows. Your heating will then get up to the right temperature and will last longer. Your thermostat will just keep kicking in more heat to get to the desired level of heat, and keep going if the air's filled with moisture. Hopefully I haven't bored the listeners with too much technical information.
No, not at all, Gary. I mean, these tips are quite helpful, and I'm saying this because I'll be honest with you. I would say I was a culprit, many years back, where I thought keep the place warm, don't open up the windows, and then I actually had mold develop in my place, in my abode of residence, and my daughter is asthmatic, so it triggered her, and she was very young then. At that point, we did not know, right? First, that was a trigger. We just found out that she was ending up in the hospital, or rather she was getting triggered very often, and we would have to nebulize her at home, and then took her to the hospital, and because it became quite critical at some point. And I had to then start doing some research, like, why is this, and even some of my other kids, they would have like dry coughs, but theirs weren't triggered that much, right? And it was only after doing some research that I found out. And to be honest, not a lot of people actually know this. Like, we think it's common knowledge, but it's not, right? It's almost like people assume that it's not important, but it is important. I was reading this article about a kid that I think in Awab, or I've forgotten, but there's an article about this child who passed away because the mold apparently triggered and affected the child's lungs. Dr. Goldring, please, if you don't mind, like, let's talk about this a bit more, because I really want people to understand how dangerous this can be, especially for children. Yes.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Yeah, thank you. It's one of the reasons I wanted to come on, actually, because I wanted to learn a bit more about this case myself. As a pediatrician, that I need to know about this. So I've done, I've looked at the reports, to sort of give the detail of the case, this was a really tragic case of a 2-year-old boy called Awab. Now he lived in Rochdale with his family, I understand in a 1-bedroom flat, and this was in a housing estate in Rochdale.
Yeah.
And his parents had made complaints about black mold building up in the kitchen and the bathroom, and they'd made a number of requests to have the housing addressed, the mold addressed, and to be rehoused. And then over a number of weeks, he developed like flu-like symptoms and developed difficulty in breathing. And he was taken into hospital a couple of times. And sadly, the second time he went into hospital, he had respiratory failure and he died, which is an absolute tragedy. Now, this went to a coroner's court to find out exactly what had happened. And actually, the cause of death, I think this is really important to make people aware, it was not asthma. So this is a very rare case, and it wasn't that he was an asthmatic child. We actually hear the burden, the amount of mold that he was exposed to chronically in his life caused a very rare complication, a very rare effect on his lungs, which caused a lot of swelling and inflammation in his breathing tubes and his lungs, which overwhelmed him. So the case here shows just how bad, if you like, this is the absolute extreme of what mold can do. It's not the same as what happens to children with asthma, but of course, from this case, from this tragic case, that's why we're here discussing this, because up and down the country, and I'm sure in Brent and throughout Northwest London, there are families who are in similar circumstances. We know this. Certainly as health professionals, people come into our clinics and tell us how bad. They show us pictures. I have a nurse specialist that will go to people's homes, try and understand what the problem is, but it's a really challenging problem to fix in some circumstances. Yep.
And do you mind me bringing you in here quick? In my research and just reading up, I'm reading up that there's mold, and then there's condensed mold. I wondered if you can talk about that, and maybe Ryan, you can also touch on that a little bit. Yeah, just because I guess I would like people to understand what the differences are, or what causes both of them, and so we can just be mindful of that real quick.
Well, I think Gary and Ryan are the experts on condensation and so on, but essentially condensation is water. That's the wetness, that's what you see. And mold is a plant. It's tiny weeny little mushrooms, and mushrooms need somewhere wet to grow. Mold needs somewhere wet to grow, and so if you've got a lot of condensation, you've basically watered the plant. And so wet places will promote the growth of mold, and so the two problems generally do go together.
Yeah. Gary, I saw you raise your hand up. Gary, do you want to elaborate on that as well?
Yeah. So I suppose if you say cold and wet equals mold, warm and dry equals no mold. So if the air is warm, there's less moisture in it, you're pretty safe to say that you're not going to get any issues with mold. And the condensation is how it happens. So you boil a kettle, you put washing on a radiator, you're cooking with pots with no lids on. That moisture goes into the air, and it will find the coldest part of the building it's in, or the area it's in. Generally speaking, that's an external wall. Quite a lot of the older properties throughout the country will have either a solid brick wall or a wall without a cavity, and as soon as the moisture-laden air hits that cold surface, it then becomes water droplets. So you've got the moisture, you've got a cold surface, and then eventually that's the perfect breeding ground for mould to grow. And if I could give this bit of advice now, don't leave it. It's not going to go away. It's not going to get better. You have to address the issue that's caused that to happen, which is a mixture of heating and ventilation. More importantly, one of the safest things to do in the first instance, as soon as you see it, to use a mixture, to start with a mixture of bleach and mould in a spray bottle, damp it down, so that when you do go to clean it, it doesn't become airborne. It's damp, it's wet, it's got bleach on it. Put some gloves on. Go as far as just a standard mask, and wipe it down. Dispose of the wipes that you're using, but also speak to your landlord if you're renting privately. Speak to the council if you're renting one of our homes, and if you own the property, you can either research how to do it yourself in terms of what to do to stop it coming back, but it's important not to leave it, because it won't get any better. It will get worse. You carry on doing what you're doing, it's only going to get worse. And it attacks clothes, fabrics, all surfaces, and it spreads. As Anne said, it's a plant. It's a fungus, and it will keep growing.
Okay, so in other words, if I wanted to get rid of it, I would need to use bleach and because I want to be sure.
That's the very basic way of doing it. If you see, suppose the audience, you have people from all walks of life that will have different means to do different things. A very effective way to deal with it in the early stages, and the most cost-effective, that bottle of bleach you could find for a pound or two, a non-branded one. You mix that 50-50, so a litre of bleach will get you 2 litres of diluted bleach that's still strong enough to safely use to tackle the issue when we're talking about very small areas.
Okay, Ryan, let me ask you this. So assuming I am able to clean it out, right? How do I ensure that it doesn't come back? Because, you know, just like plants, you cut them out, they'll grow back again. How do I ensure that it doesn't come back again?
No, it's a good question, and I think just going back to Gary's point, as soon as you see mold, you need to try and get rid of it and wipe it off. And you can also go and buy a solution from a supermarket, a mold washing solution, so you don't have to just use bleach and water. There are other solutions, but again, the key is ventilating the property when you're doing those activities, drying clothes, etc. And Gary also explained about condensation. And in the ideal world, you need to warm your property up so that when the moisture in the air is looking for a cold surface, there are no real cold surfaces for it to form on. And that's how you will reduce the amount of condensation you have in your property, which then will form the damp and mold. But it seems simple, but it's not easy for everyone to do. And we know that where you live in a flat, for instance, you can't go and dry clothes outside in the garden. Sometimes you'll have to put them on the radiators. But what we say is if you are going to put clothes on the radiators, just ventilate, open a window above the radiator and ventilate at the same time. It's a daily challenge that people have to go through, and they need to get into the practice of every time they're producing lots of moisture in their property, ventilating at the same time.
Okay, that's interesting. And
could I add something to it as well?
Please,
Douglas,
please.
That's
please,
okay.
So
At Brent, we're responsible for carrying out repairs and maintenance to Brent's housing stock. And one of the things we're doing at the moment, this is specifically for our tenants, is all reports of damp and mould will result in an inspection from a surveyor. And where there is an issue with damp and mould, we will upgrade any mechanical extraction. Those are the fans in your bathrooms, your kitchens, your toilets, with a humidity controlled version. So they'll kick in for you. They'll be moisture within the air will trigger the fan to turn on, and it will switch off when it gets to a level that it's happy with, a level that won't promote mold growth. We do a 2-stage mold treatment, and the 3rd stage being using a mold inhibiting paint for those rooms affected. I think at some point in this conversation we're going to discuss the issues around the cost of heating homes, because that is, we're all feeling it. Some have more disposable income than others, and some people simply have the choice to make as to whether they heat their home, they feed their family. And it's, if we only do one thing, and it's ventilate in short periods, reduce that moisture level, that's all we can ask.
Yeah.
Just means that you'll be a little bit less warm in your home, but you'll reduce the risk of having an issue with mold.
Okay. I was going to ask Anne, and then we're going to come back to this conversation about the cost of heating homes, because that's an interesting topic. But I wanted to just ask Anne real quick. And so from some of the symptoms that we have mentioned earlier, right? Earlier symptoms of mold that mold can trigger. Is there any medical advice that you can give on how to manage those symptoms, whatever they are, whether it's the rash or it's the cough and whatnot? How does one manage that, or do we run straight to the hospital?
Not usually, but obviously if somebody's child can't breathe, then 999 and running straight to the hospital are the appropriate things to do. Yeah. So I think if a child has a cough or a cold, everyone's children get coughs and colds, and there are very few people who would make a doctor's appointment or call 111. Most people manage that at home with home remedies and just lots of cuddles and patience. I think if a child is coughing persistently, so they're coughing when they exercise, or they're coughing whenever they go out in the cold air, or they are coughing in the night time, that they seem to cough even when they haven't got a cold, that usually is a sign that you ought to be thinking about coming to see somebody at your doctor's surgery. And I know people have, that there aren't enough GPs for the number of patients, so people do struggle. But don't be afraid of contacting your surgery. You can see the GP, you can see one of our clinical pharmacists, you can see your practice nurse. There are people who are there, and we want to see children who've got persistent respiratory symptoms, because many of them will have treatable problems, and we don't want children suffering from things that we could help with. Yeah. In terms of self-managing, obviously, I'm not going to, the people at Brent know how to manage a cough and a cold. In terms of if a child has allergies, your community pharmacy is a really good first place to go, because they will have lots of advice about over-the-counter medicines and non-drug things that you can do for a child with allergies. Same goes for adults. It's rare that you will have a child with asthma or allergies in a house where one of the adults hasn't got it too. Don't know, I'm kind of running out of things to say now. Stephen.
I appreciate that. Stephen, do you want to, from a medical point of view, do you want to chime in as well? Are there thoughts, advice that you can give as well on this?
No, I think Anne's covered it, but I guess I would say, then, if your child has got a diagnosis of asthma, and that mold is a problem, it's actually still the same approach, and that is, a simple message with asthma. There's a steroid inhaler, which is usually a brown inhaler. That's the preventer. That's the one that stops the inflammation building up in the chest. Right. So I'd really, a bit of a plug for people who have asthma to really concentrate on taking that preventer all the time. I think of it like brushing your teeth. You do it in the morning and the evening, and don't stop. And that will stop the inflammation building up that causes all the symptoms of the wheezing and cough and breathlessness and things. Right. So that's just good, good asthma management is what you need.
Yeah. Uh, uh, Gary, Ryan, I want to talk. I want you to take on the topic on the cost of heating. But before I do that, real quick, Gary, I know you mentioned earlier that you're essentially the one that is being called on when mold is detected or when anything in the housing, when there's mold detected in the housing. And I wanted to just ask you, are there any challenges that you have faced so far? I mean, from the residents, perhaps not reporting, not wanting to report it, maybe for fear of needing to move out before the mold gets sorted out. Like, are there any such fears, or have you encountered such?
There's such a varied sort of reason and examples of people that have suffered mold in the home. Quite often, not sure of the percentages within Brent, but quite often it's a lack of understanding. I don't think people generally want to live with mold. And I think the historically, this is across the industry as a whole, it's that the messages have been completely different to those that we're delivering now at Brent. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to read the Spotlight on Mold, which goes into detail. It's what the Ombudsman, the Housing Ombudsman, provided or delivered, and it's historically residents have felt like they've been mistreated and told that it's their fault. And it's, unless you know how to prevent something happening and you understand the reasoning for it, it's I think a little bit unfair to make people feel like that.
Right.
The word lifestyle used to be bandied about. Oh, it's your lifestyle. You need to change your lifestyle, and it sounds quite derogatory. We don't use that at Brent anymore. We haven't done for a while. I've been guilty of it in the past, but and I've suffered from, like you. I had mold in my flat years ago, 20 odd years ago, and it's because I lived on a ground floor flat. I couldn't leave my windows open after I showered in the morning because I was going to work, so I had mold in my flat. So that was because of my lifestyle, that I liked to shower in the morning and then I went to work, but it didn't mean that I wanted it. And this was before I understood how to prevent it and what the cause or the reason was. But in terms of the issues we're facing at Brent, we've reached out to residents that have reported damp and mold historically, going back 7 years. And we're currently running a program to revisit and remedy the issues that contributed to it. Whether or not they've continued or it's not there anymore as an issue, because people have learnt to resolve it. And we're upgrading everyone's fans that don't have a humidistat fan, because it's so much easier to use a smart device that kicks in when it needs to than find out when you see mold on the windowsill or in the corner or in your wardrobe on your new clothes. So I think there's not a one sort of example that would cover everybody, but the progress and the works we're doing will affect everyone that suffers from damp and mold.
Right.
Yeah.
There is one point I want to just make, and maybe you can touch on that as well, real quick. And that is, I don't know about you, but I'm a married man, and my wife likes clothes. Most women like clothes. They have a lot of clothes, right? And sometimes the wardrobes are just clustered with clothes. I was reading up that when you also have too many clothes, like clustered in, that could cause mold as well. Did you want to touch on that as well?
Yeah. So if we go back to what I said earlier about opening your windows for 10 or 15 minutes,
right?
You could even do it in 5 or 10 minutes. If you open a window at each end of your home, open all the doors, because airflow is important. Airflow will reduce the risk of having cold spots in places. So homes in the UK aren't huge. They're not like homes in some countries where you're spoilt for space. So
right.
Quite often you've got your sofa tucked in one corner, you've got a table in another corner, you've got a bookcase, or you've got furniture. And it's the same with bedrooms. And as families grow, belongings grow. And that means that you end up with lots of cold spots. That's called cold bridging. And that basically helps bring the cold in,
Right.
and it creates that perfect environment for mold to grow. You get that quite a lot in cupboards and wardrobes, particularly with built-in wardrobes, because there's zero insulation in the older stock. There's very little, if any, as you said, if they're packed to the rafters with lots of different items, shoes at the bottom, clothes all hanging, and then stuff folded up at the top. That's a perfect place for mold to grow. It's a mushroom, so it's dark, it's cold, and potentially wet. So airflow, if you can have a little gap, a couple of inches or an inch behind the sofa, it's better than not having any space at all. But again, that's a whole different conversation around overcrowding.
I'm happy you share that, because initially my argument was with the missus, were like, you know what, you better stop buying so many clothes. Like, I'm trying to get her to stop buying clothes, but I guess, and I can't win that battle. I just can't win the battle.
I can give you some advice for your wife to put a vent in the top and the bottom of the door if you've got a built-in wardrobe, or yeah, that's a really good way. But also reduce some of it, have a declutter.
Okay, that's a good advice. All right, Ryan, let me bring you in real quick. Let's talk about the cost of heating. I mean, that is also a very important subject to talk about, because at the end of the day, it really comes down to what can we afford, right? I mean, and we just know that the economy is just not. I mean, the world economy in general is not going in the right direction at the moment. So, what is Brent doing to mitigate and to help the community in this regard?
Yeah, so I think we've got Brent Council. We've got a link that I'm hoping you're going to share, Douglas.
Absolutely.
Of cost saving things you can do to save some money on energy bills. And there's also funds that you can tap into as well if you need financial support. So there's a cost of living payment, which is an extra one-off payment that you can get from the council. Also, there's a cold weather payment as well, which is £25 every 7 days. But again, you have to qualify for this. So you have to have the financial circumstances to qualify. There's also warm home discount schemes and winter fuel payments. So there is support out there for people who are really struggling to heat their homes and are struggling with their energy bills. But again, as I said earlier, with damp and mold, if at the very least people ventilate when they're creating when they're creating moisture, that will also help with the damp and mold within their properties. But again, there is a lot. So if people can go to the website and check out the money saving tips on there and some of the help that they might be able to get.
I want to just read this out just to give the listeners a specific place where they can go to. And so if you're worried about the cost of heating your home, you can visit the Brent Council website to get like saving tips and information on where you can find financial supports for your bills. The website is www.brent.gov.uk/cost of living. All right. And Ryan, you talked about the warmwelcome.uk. Your line was kind of breaking off, so I didn't quite get that. But if you don't mind just touching on that a little bit, because what I was reading is like for people who are looking for places that they want to go someplace and stay warm.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is where we've got some of our hubs, our Brent hubs. So in the daytime, like we might have community centres that aren't being used in the daytime for any events. We keep those open so people can go there and keep warm, so they don't have to keep their heating on. And you can find out about all of those warm weather places on our website as well.
Cool. Now, if and this is a hypothetical scenario, but if I discover mold in my house, is it my responsibility to deal with it, or should I be complaining to my landlord to deal with it? Like, what's your advice here? What's the advice here?
I'll start off and I'll let Gary come in, but our advice would be to speak to your landlord straight away, because as we know, damp and mold can be formed due to condensation, but can be formed due to water ingress externally. So roof leaks, gutter leaks, etc. Lack of pointing on the brickwork on the outside of your property. So always go to your landlord and ask your landlord to come and have a look and check out to make sure there's no issues with the building, no structural issues. And the landlord will send someone out to inspect and then advise you of what you might need to do to resolve the issue if it's not to do with the structure of the property. So I would always say speak to your landlord if you've got any damp or mold in the property.
Right. Ryan?
Gary?
Sorry, Gary.
That's okay. Yeah, I echo what Ryan said, but also I think there are different expectations and different responsibilities depending on who your landlord is. I would encourage anyone that's listening that is a Brent Council tenant, you can email us if you've got an issue with damp and mould. We have a dedicated email address that you can contact us on, and that's dampandmould@brent.gov.uk. Pretty simple. It says what it does. And as I said, if you are a Brent tenant, we will arrange for a surveyor to come to your home and inspect and get to the root cause of the problem. And yeah, that's a service that we do. In terms of in the private sector, whether you're renting from a private landlord, you're renting from a housing association, contact them as soon as you can. It's, as Ryan said, they're not always, the actual root cause isn't always as straightforward as it might seem. And I'll go back to what I said earlier. Historically, the response was, it's your fault. I think now, with it being so in the forefront of people's minds, and you've only got to watch TV or listen to the radio, and you'll hear that there are issues out there that are not always as clear cut as people first assumed. And it's better to let us know sooner rather than later, because we know what the outcome can be if it's left too long.
So I've got a text that just came in, and first of all, let me just say thanks for this, David. I've got a text that just came in, and this is from David. Let me read it out. He says, "I live in 5th floor, and when I take a shower with my towel, I can't hang it to dry, so it is usually damp, and I have to just like hang it on a chair." And he says it always kind of dampens the room or dampens everywhere. I guess what he's trying to say is, you know, we shower, those of us who do shower every morning. I mean, Gary, you said you like to do that. I like to shower every morning as well. And you know what I do, which I don't think is very energy efficient, is I put on my heater so that I can hang the towel to dry, because I'm usually afraid that it would stay damp, and it gets this funny smell. And if you're not careful, that can just you know, pass on as well. But yeah, in David's case, is a problem that he can't put on his heating, and I think that's what he's really getting at. So, what's your advice here? Like, what advice would you give to David here?
First of all, the best place to dry your washing is your bathroom. It sounds a little bit, it might sound a little bit wacky to some listeners, but that room is the best equipped room of the house to manage moisture. One of the things that's quite important is to have an extractor fan if you don't have a window. If you have a window and in your bathroom, you can dry your washing in your bathroom, you can shut the door, crack the window open a little bit, that moisture would escape. It wants to get back into the air, into the atmosphere. It wants to just go out into the air, basically, for want of a better term. I wouldn't recommend, unless you absolutely have to, putting clothes on radiators. Some people might have to. I grew up in a council house. There's a lot of us. I'm one of 5 boys, and my mum did use the radiator because she didn't have a tumble dryer, but she'd open the window. You have to make do with what you've got and work with it the best you can. So if you break one of the rules, which is you shouldn't really use a radiator, make sure you've got a means for the moisture to escape. I think in the bathroom, if you leave washing in there, you can get areas that are specifically made to sit over baths. So if they're there and they're dripping wet, the water will run into the bath and it will go down the plug hole. and also when it starts to dry, it can go out of the window. And there's less chance. Most bathrooms have got tiling, they've got a vinyl floor, so they're geared up to manage moisture, splashes of water when you're in the bath or when you're getting out of the shower. But in terms of did you say your caller's name was David?
Yeah.
And he can't put the heating on. Am I right in saying that's because he can't afford
he can't
to?
put the heating. I mean, he didn't mention that, but I'm assuming it's because he doesn't want to put it on. So essentially, when he leaves the house, he doesn't want to leave the heating on and
absolutely
and have the towel dry up. Yeah.
So first of all, if he has got a problem with his heating and it's not working, obviously speak to his landlord, whoever that is. It's very cold out at the moment. It was quite cold today. It's been cold for a good while, obviously, for this time in the year. His towel will probably take longer to dry at this time of year. I don't know, thinking outside the box, can he take the towel where he's going and dry it there? Because it's going to stay cold. If it's cold in his house, you need some form of heat to promote that drying process. It's like putting your clothes outside to dry in the winter. They'll turn stiff because the cold will freeze them.
Right.
So there has to be some form of heating to kickstart that drying process. It doesn't have to be a huge amount of heat. As Ryan said, it could be 18 degrees. It would still be sufficient over time to dry David's towel.
Yeah, that's a bit of a difficult one right there. David, I first of all, let me just say thanks for sending that text. But I guess what I will do is maybe I'll follow up with you, and gents, maybe behind the scenes we can even find other solutions for David, because yeah, that is, and as he sent in the text, I was thinking to myself, yeah, that actually happens to me, but the way I solve it might not even be the right way to do it. So I get that. Dr. Goldring, you know, let me just bring you in real quick, and this is for as a pediatrician, you've talked a great deal about how to manage children who have who develop these asthma-like symptoms or who are asthmatic simply triggered by mold. Beyond the fact that the mold has been discovered and it's been treated, are there any other, in your opinion, any other health tips in terms of what the parent should be doing for the child to serve as a preventive mechanism? So yes, deal with the mold, but is there anything else that, from a medical point of view, that one should be doing to even prevent having to be susceptible to such triggers?
Well, I think, you know, follow the advice of your doctor around your asthma treatments. So taking your regular preventer is the key for managing asthma.
Right.
So, you know, you've got your brown preventer inhaler that needs to be taken regularly. It can actually be a very frustrating problem. Some children have asthma, but if you don't get rid of a mold, they'll keep having asthma symptoms. As the case, you know, but we discussed earlier, the tragic boy that died in Rochdale showed, you know, at its absolute severity, it's a really big problem. That case has had a big impact on housing. You know, you can see that Brent is being really proactive here to address this, but there are a lot of frustrated people who live in very challenging circumstances, and you know, it's actually very hard for them to find solutions, because there's not an easy answer if you've still got the mold. Particularly, I mean, I think some of the frustrating cases that I deal with, people that have, you know, we've talked about a lot of mold that's come from within their own property, but people that I can think of, patients who are in flats and the flat above them is leaking, and they've got mold in the ceiling, in the corners of their houses. It's nothing to do with the way that they, you know, they look after their house, and you know, they've been very hard to get those kind of things fixed. And you know, it's also challenging to get rehoused. So there's a lot of frustration that I hear from patients. Sorry, I've gone off track a bit there, but
yeah. No, it's fine. It's fine. I mean, I'm even glad that you went this far, because just thinking about it, it's not just in the homes that we're likely to be affected by these molds, right? Essentially what you're saying is it could be anywhere. And I could be working in a particular workplace. Not that my workplace is fine, but I'm just saying I could be working in a particular workplace and I may not even be able to see the mold, but I just find out that I'm always, I'm triggered, right?
Yes.
But the mold is hidden and I can't see it, and yet it's in the air.
Yeah, there's millions of types of molds and spores, and just like pollens from tree and grass, people can have asthma attacks triggered by molds. I mean, the classic one in asthma is when children get what's sometimes called thunderstorm asthma attacks, and sometimes there are these big kind of episodes where lots and lots of people in a community get asthma exacerbations, asthma attacks, and thunderstorms kind of encourage all the spores in the environment to be released, and they can trigger off asthma. So yes, you're right, the spores are everywhere, and everyone with asthma is susceptible.
Yeah. If you have been listening to the show, this is an episode, this is our monthly episode called The Brent Health Matters, where we talk about major health issues, and we bring in experts and people with lived-in experience to kind of like guide us on how to manage certain situations and also how to avoid them. And today we're talking about the ill effects of damp and mold. And if you find out that you have been living with such, I think it is high time that you don't take it for granted and actually understand that there's a health risk attached to ignoring that. And as the good doctor, good people on the show, like I said, is that you first off try as much as possible to speak to your landlord, to have the property checked out to see where the mold is coming from, what is causing it, and get it sorted out. Don't ignore it, because it can cause major health damages. And I'm going to allow everyone just to give me a few final words before we wrap up the show. As a GP at Wembley, I'm sure you've come across a lot of patients with that, but any last advice that you would give to the listeners today on things that they should look out for?
Well, I suppose one last thing really, our Brent Council, they've got the Brent hubs in Harlesden, in Kilburn, Kingsbury, there's one in Willesden, there's one in Wembley, where people can go to get advice to make sure they're getting all the benefits that they should be entitled to. And that makes a big difference when it comes to housing conditions, when it comes to being able to keep your heating on. Specifically as a GP, I would say people don't claim often the disability benefits that they're entitled to. So there is, for adults, there's personal independence payment. For kids, it's called disability living allowance. For older adults, it's called attendance allowance. And that's additional money, which is not means tested. So you can get it whether or not you're working. It's on top of other benefits. And it would also give people some protection from the benefits cap. Because one of the things we know is that some moisture comes from breathing. So you could have everything done perfectly in your home, but if you have several people in a small home and everyone's breathing, there will inevitably be moisture in that home. And there are lots of people out there with disabilities who aren't getting the benefits that they're entitled to, and who could be living in better conditions and less troubled by mould. So I'd encourage anyone who's in any doubt to contact the Brent hubs and ask for help in making sure they get what they're entitled to.
Absolutely, thanks. Dr. Goldring, your last words on this?
Yeah, I think take it seriously. If you've got damp and mold, do something about it. And if you do have a child with asthma, make sure they take their regular medicines. And if you're worried about it, get a review from your GP, your asthma nurse.
Absolutely. Okay. And let me go with Gary first before we wrap up with Ryan. Gary, do you want to give us your last thoughts on
yeah, so treat it early. If the quickest thing you can do is wash with a water bleach solution, just to make it safe for that moment, please do that. If you're a Brent tenant and that you pay rent to Brent Council, please reach out if you're suffering from damp and mould. The easiest way to do that is to email dampandmould@brent.gov.uk. Damp and mould, all one word, no dots. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. All right. And Ryan, last but not least, what are your thoughts, Ryan? What's the last piece of advice you can give us?
Yeah, so Gary kind of stole my thunder with the damp and mould at brent.gov.uk.
Yeah.
But just to say that we at Brent Council, we take these issues very seriously. Even before our Awab Ishaq's death, we were writing to all of our residents who had reported damp and mould in the previous 7 years, because we know it's an issue, we know it's a health issue, and we know it causes disrepair in property. So Brent Council, we have a zero tolerance response to damp and mould. So like Gary said, if there's an issue, please contact us as soon as possible, and we'll be out to try and resolve it.
Absolutely. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for being on the show and actually giving me the opportunity to have this amazing conversation with you. For everybody else who's listening, I want to remind you guys that if you are in any way worried about the cost of heating your homes, all right, the Brent Council has made certain provisions available. You can visit the Brent Council website for everything about saving tips and information and on financial support that you can get, which is at brent.gov.uk/cost of living. Also, we mentioned this earlier, I think Gary mentioned this, there are, hubs or places where you can go to just in case you want to keep warm around your area. Please check out Warm Welcome UK. You can also brent.hub.com. I think I covered all the websites accurately. And to everybody else, please make sure you take it seriously. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a lovely day. We're going to be back next week, next month, Wednesday, for another interesting topic on Brent Head Council. All right, have a good evening.